I am become death, I am the destroyer of worlds. This is sort of a grandiose sentence that I read a couple of years ago, and I learned that it was sort of attributed to the physicist Robert Oppenheimer after he had been involved in the development of nuclear weapons for the United States in the early 1940s. But when we actually look into where that statement originally comes from, we learn that it actually comes from a book called the Bhagavad Gita, which tells the tale of a young warrior named Arjuna, who is about to join battle against his own family and friends for control of a grand empire. And he's flanked at the time by Sri Krishna, who in the book we learn is his charioteer. But in actual fact, the Bhagavad Gita is not about a grandiose battle amongst family for the control of an empire. It's actually the battle of the self, the struggle of our higher self versus our lower self. And Arjuna is not actually flanked by a charioteer, he's actually flanked by Sri Krishna, a Hindu god. What's very interesting about this story is it links from an academic perspective or a philosophical perspective to that concept of the Enlightenment. The internal struggle that is within about our sort of our primordial selves versus our more rational self. And it's something that has always interested me, not just in later life, but even as a young undergrad. I remember coming across the concept of the negotiated self in social psychology. The idea that we present a version of ourselves to society, to our family, to our friends, to our wider community. And then that community sort of pushes back. And then we sort of settle on a compromise or collaborative version of ourselves as we go forward and develop in life. And it's something that I have come across again and again. Very recently I was watching a video on YouTube from the Harvard professor Jordan Peterson, who spoke about this concept, about how it's integral to us. The barriers that we face, we either surmount them, we pull back from them, learn a different way. And we also see from philosophy and academia old thinkers coming from the opposite side, saying, well, what happens if we don't have struggle? The old German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, he goes so extreme as to say, if we don't have struggle, if we don't have something to push against, well then what do we have? We have the worst possible outcome for human beings, which is boredom. There's nothing worse than a bored human being. And again, we look at the oft-derided Robert Malthus, who can seem quite dry when you read him the first time, but he has a very basic notion, which is we don't wake up in the morning and go to work to create a utopia. We get up in the morning and go to work to stay a step ahead of misery. It's misery and struggle that drives us forward as we look over our shoulders. And then finally, and most recently, I came across an excellent reading which was part of my studies as a postgrad, and it was the idea of the use of violence in the Civil War context. And it was written by a gentleman by the name of Stathis Kalevas. He looked specifically at members of the Greek community during the Second World War, particularly when Nazi Germany was in control. And what he found is that even though we may look at a wider conflict from very sort of grandiose geopolitical standpoints, when you actually looked at the individual uses of violence or conflicts, a lot of the time it was based on what we sort of can call the dark side of social capital. Even when Nazi Germany was on the cusp of losing the Second World War and people knew the Allies were coming, locals would still ally themselves with German soldiers in order to settle old scores with neighbors and former friends who they had had a grievance with. And Kalevas came up or posited an incredible notion which I thought was quite interesting, in that in any wider conflict where we see group movement, really only 5 to 7% of that group are driven ideologues. So what does that give us? That gives us 90+% of a given group are actually joining a struggle for a variety of different reasons, be they particularly personal, tribal, political, ethnic, whatever. And we don't just see this, or we haven't just seen this in past conflicts. Exactly the same situation popped its head up again during the Second American War, if you want to call it that, in Iraq. where when the original war to topple Saddam turned into a war on terror, so on and so forth, local US military commanders noticed that a lot of the intelligence they were being fed from the ground, the so-called denunciations, as in neighbor one going in and saying that neighbor two is Al-Qaeda, I know he is. And then when they would actually follow that line of inquiry, they would realize he wasn't Al-Qaeda at all. They had just had a very personal grievance. So we realized that not only is struggle formative and to an extent vital in our own personal development, it's also very important for our cultural development. And even think of very simple examples. Constructivists in political science will tell us that our historical background feeds into how we make decisions and why we make decisions even as nation states. And I won't dwell on it, but compare two huge contrasting countries. Look at Ireland and look at the United States of America. We have a certain amount of shared history, we have economic ties, we have a shared language. But when we look at how we actually operate and how we see ourselves in the world, we're very, very different. Look at how Irish people deal with military intervention. Look at how we deal with the ownership of property. Look at how we deal with, as we heard just recently, debt. Now then look at the United States, and it's the whole concept of United States exceptionalism. The idea that we're so big we can pretty much do what we want. And it's not so much that it's just because of the way they are now, it is how we have formed over time. But the theoretical idea of how, even in a wider sort of conflict or context, we can still be driven by our very personal struggles, which can seem counterintuitive. I saw this myself during my 3 overseas deployments with the Defence Forces. The most striking example of this would have been back in 2008. I was lucky enough to deploy to Kosovo, and I didn't realize it then, but looking at the way missions are now, I had a colossal amount of freedom. Freedom of movement, freedom to sort of identify where I thought there was issues, explain it to my boss, and go and try and deal with it. There was one particular episode where one of our flanking forces, the Swedes, had to move out of an area we called the Serb enclave. Now this not only housed the biggest Serb community in an area that was predominantly Kosovo Albanian at the time, but it also housed some incredibly important historical sites, not just for Serbs, but also for Orthodox Christianity. Just because of the way it came, I was ordered to go up and basically, with my platoon, take over that area for the 2-week period while the Swedes were gone. And in my naivety and my sort of elevated levels of energy, I thought that I was going to go and meet every village leader in the enclave over a space of 2 days. I'll never forget my 3rd meeting. I went in thinking I was a great fella. I went in telling this village leader, I said, listen, I'm here, it's all sorted. That sort of air of positivity, that was pretty much it when I stopped talking. The conversation went downhill very quickly. Not only was I berated personally, myself and the lads were berated, Ireland even got a good sort of side swipe. I don't know how he managed to fit Ireland into the conversation. But in general, he was accusing us of being disengaged bystanders while the Serb community were being ethnically cleansed by basically settlement building by Kosovo Albanians, which technically was true. You could quite physically see houses being built on the outskirts. So this went back and forth. He came out with some threats. We deflected it. That was fine. But during the conversation, he took a phone call. And he actually made a note of stopping himself talking and saying to me, can't you see how cosmopolitan I am? I'm speaking Albanian on the phone, which was rare enough, but I said, right, that's grand. Anyway, the meeting finished, and I went off to walk to my car. And my interpreter said to me on the way to the car, she said, do you want to know what his phone call was about? I said, yeah, please tell me. She said, he was selling land to a Kosovo Albanian from within the enclave during that meeting. So I didn't really react with anger or sort of pessimism. I said, that's actually very interesting. I said, here's a person who has not only modeled themselves as being the sort of spokesperson for their community, but they've actually managed to convince the rest of their community that they are that sort of person. But here they are being driven and trying to get out of the situation as much for themselves, despite the fact that their community was on, at that stage, the wrong side of history. And it was something, again, that really struck me when I traveled to Uganda in 2011. The European Union, and I'm sure we've all seen Captain Phillips, and we were all aware of sort of Somali piracy, But that actually wasn't the reason we were there. We traveled to Uganda to carry out one of two major missions the European Union was taking part in. EU was trying to deal with piracy in the north, but the transitional federal government had very little control of Mogadishu. It pretty much had control of a tiny block in central Mogadishu. So the European Union said, okay, we're going to have to try and go in, train some military forces, and give them some breathing room. And we went in with a very sort of archetypal Western European idea. We're going to go in here now with best practice, logic, rationale. We're going to explain to these people and train them up to what is the best way to execute, what's the best way to do things. And I had to say, I did laugh at the time, we also had to include instruction on patriotism, the Somali flag, Somali history. Needless to say, I felt a little bit awkward explaining to Somali men how important their history was. But as we built trust, or as they sort of began to trust us more, they began to explain to us why exactly they were there. And we realized that even though we were there for grand geopolitical notions of we need to try and stabilize this government, government was mentioned rarely, if at all. When young fellas were having smoke breaks or during our breaks during the day, they'd actually say to us, listen, I'm here as long as the wages last. Once the wages are gone, I'm out of here. I'm actually going to sell the rifle, sell the uniform, I'm gone. And then you would say to the next fellow, well, why are you here? And they'd say, listen, I'm here because Al-Shabaab has killed my entire family. I have nowhere else to go. So that's why I'm here. Next guy, my tribe told me so. I don't even really know what's going on. I'm just told, turn up, fight them. So you actually then realize we can have grand notions of why a struggle is taking place. But when you go and you meet people face to face, you realize that it can be quite personal. And then most recently, last year, my last overseas mission was to Western Sahara, a mission which I had actually joked with some of my classmates at the time. I said, lads, you know what? Out of all the missions we're on, I have no idea what's going on in Western Sahara. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call. How are you fixed for Western Sahara? I said, right, grand. Last April, I'd come back from leave, and I was informed by the senior Irish officer out there that the situation was turning a little bit sour. Without going into the long history of it, I was based out with a group called the Sahrawi, who are the original indigenous people of the area, and they're pretty much cut off in the desert, literally behind a massive sand wall that the Moroccans have built. The problem was the Sahrawi were getting a little bit annoyed with the fact that nothing had really progressed. But when I eventually got back to my team site out in the desert and I spoke with these guys individually, they explained to me, they said, listen, this is not really about the referendum or the fact that there hasn't been one. It's not really about the passports, even though we're saying that's what it is. They said, the young people are losing faith. They're losing faith in the movement because they can't get a job, they can't lead a normal life. Some of them have grown to adulthood in a refugee camp in Algeria. And it's the basics that are now pushing them away from us. And the concern was not only will they lose faith in the sort of wider struggle, they could eventually radicalize. So over 3 completely different theaters or arenas, I've seen how we can go in with concepts of thinking that we have rationalized what a big picture struggle is. But when you speak to people individually, it's very rare that you get somebody who will bang the table about the wider principled sort of political struggle that's involved. A lot of the time, it's very, very personal. That's what drives people. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump forward, because part of me has a little bit of a concern. I have a concern that if we fixate on our personal struggles, which can and are very real, that we can then miss very, very big struggles that are not even far down the road, but could be imminent. There's 2 areas in particular I'd like to talk about. One I'm not going to talk about for too long because we've heard about it, but another one is one that I'm even struggling to figure out which side I fall on at the minute. The first one, let's say, is the easy one, global warming. I find it fascinating how we look at this as a sort of a far-off problem. Even those of us who believe that it's an issue say, this is very, very serious, but we don't take any real action to mitigate against it. I was terrified after reading an article a couple of years ago in Foreign Affairs magazine, and the author came out with a couple of simple statistics and dates in his opening paragraph. He said, we originally thought that northern Canada would be navigable by 2070. That was then revised to 2035. After studying 2012 and the temperatures of Greenland, they now figure that by 2020, we should be able to navigate quite quickly in areas that we've never been able to navigate before. To the extent that there's communities in northern Canada who not only used to be subsistence fishermen, are now exporting fish for the first time in their existence because they can get access to the water because there's no ice. That's one, and it's one that I find very interesting in particular, and we think about these things even domestically. When we have sort of conversations about a Paris summit, or we go on about we need to do X, Y, and Z, but at the same time we know, well, we're not really going to touch agriculture, even though we know methane is a major contributor to CO2. The other subject, which is the one that I really find intriguing, is artificial intelligence. I don't know if many of you have heard of him, but there's a neuroscientist in the United States called Sam Harris. I listen to his podcast all the time. But I remember actually getting into a blazing argument on a Sunday, as I usually do with my mother, about something completely outside of our control, but we really get invested in. And I was basically saying how artificial intelligence is going to be a game changer. Life is going to be fantastic. And she was saying, are you crazy? There's so many assumptions built into what you're saying. And Sam Harris sort of came out with some very logical thoughts about the same thing. And there's just a few things I'd like to just throw out from the perspective of thinking about them as opposed to me having an answer, because I don't. We all look back at the Luddites, a group of people who sort of decried industrial revolution sort of change. So sure, if we build a printing press, if we build sort of textiles, that does us out of a job. And what's interesting is innovation and industrial revolutions in the past, which did away with, let's say, the need for a dray horse, or even the need for extensive human labor. Have we actually thought about the fact that we're probably jumping into a world now where we may not need human mental labor? What happens when our accountants and our lawyers may not necessarily be as efficient as Watson from IBM? And what's really interesting is we have gone down a road of technological development, which, let's be honest, it cannot be stopped outside of a catastrophic event. But the actual impact it has, not just on our viability as contributing workers, but also on our ability to choose. How often do we open our phone and we're fascinated by the fact that Google is suggesting to us what we should be doing before we've even gotten out of bed? So what I've ultimately seen through academia and life is that we can be driven by struggle. It's hugely important to us in how we form who we are. And on a daily basis, yes, it's totally understandable that we fixate on the struggle that is visceral. But for us to continue on, not just for ourselves, but even for the children that are already born, I think we're going to have to make a leap to start looking at the group struggle and say, is that as much of an existential threat to me as an individual struggle might be? And there's that going back to the old sort of German philosophers, the old idea of we need to develop from the idea of the Gemeinschaft, about myself, to the Gesellschaft, about the group. Thank you very much.